Paper Vows, Episode 2, The Terms, written by Mia. I signed away a year of my life on a Wednesday morning in a glass conference room 40 floors above the city, with a fountain pen that probably cost more than the seascape I'd been cleaning when my old life ended. I had read the contract 4 times by then. I'd read it at the gallery counter the night he left, by the light of the one lamp I could still afford to run, with the foreclosure notice sitting beside it like a chaperone. I'd read it again at 2 a.m, and again at 5, and a 4th time on the train into the city with my heart going like a trapped bird, and I had found, to my surprise, that it was exactly what he'd said it was. No traps in the small print. No clever clause that turned me into a possession. It was almost insultingly fair, generous even, which somehow made it worse because it meant he had thought about my dignity, and a man who thinks about your dignity is a much harder man to keep at the distance a year requires. The lawyers withdrew once I'd signed. Adrian stayed. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his back to me, and the whole gray city laid out below him like something he was deciding whether to buy, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and I understood that the silence was going to be a feature of my life now, this man and his enormous quiet rooms. I had signed in 3 places, each flagged with a small adhesive arrow, and at the last one my hand had hovered a second too long, and Adrian had watched it hover and said nothing, which was somehow the most decent thing he could have done. Because in that second I had felt the whole weight of it, that I was selling a year of my one life to a stranger, that my mother would have had opinions, large and loud and loving opinions, that the girl who'd grown up believing love was the only thing worth being broke for was about to marry a man who had warned her in writing not to feel a thing. And then I had thought of the gallery's scuffed parquet, the footprints of everyone who had ever loved a painting in that room, and the bank's merciless font underneath, and I had pressed the absurd pen to the paper and made my hand stop shaking through pure stubbornness, which was the only inheritance that had ever actually paid out. So, it was done. I did not feel married. I felt purchased, and oddly, underneath that, the smallest disgraceful thread of relief, because for the first time in 18 months, something larger than me was going to help hold the gallery up, even if that something was a man made of glass. "It's done, then," I said, capping the absurd pen. "You have a wife. Congratulations. You don't look thrilled."
"I'm rarely thrilled."
It unsettles people. He turned. In the flat northern light his face was all clean planes and that closed-door stillness, but his eyes moved over me the way they had in the gallery, reading, cataloging, missing nothing. "You changed your hair." I washed the paint out of it. For the occasion. I tucked a strand behind my ear, suddenly and stupidly self-conscious. I clean up. Not to your world standard, but I own 2 good dresses now instead of 1, so the trajectory is promising. He didn't smile, but something eased at the corner of his mouth, the ghost of the thing he'd put down in the gallery, and he said, "You talk when you're nervous." "I talk all the time. The nervousness just changes the subject matter." I stood, smoothing the second of my 2 good dresses. "So, husband, what happens now? Do I get a tour of the cage? Or do I find the rooms by trial and error like a rat in a maze?" Something flickered at Cage. He covered it. "I'll show you the house," he said. "And then we should talk about the next 4 weeks, because the wedding is the easy part. It's the marriage people will be watching." The house was not a house. It was a statement, made in glass and pale stone, perched above the river like something that had landed rather than been built, and walking into it for the first time, as its mistress, I felt exactly as out of place as he had looked in my mother's gallery, a warm, untidy, paint under the fingernails thing dropped into a museum of right angles. It was beautiful, I'll give it that. It was also the loneliest room I had ever stood in, and there were a great many rooms. "The East Wing is yours," Adrian said, leading me through it with the brisk neutrality of an estate agent. Bedroom, bath, a studio. I had it fitted out. North light. You'll want north light for the restoration work. I assumed you'd want to keep taking commissions. He said it as though it were nothing, as though he had not, in the middle of arranging a fake marriage, quietly built a working studio for a stranger because he noticed she loved her work. I stopped in the doorway of it. There were easels. Good ones. A wall of the exact north light my mother's gallery had. The light I'd thought I was losing forever, reproduced 40 floors up in a glass tower by a man who claimed to feel nothing. I walked into the middle of it. The easels were birch, the good kind, the kind I'd coveted in catalogs and never once been able to justify. A rack of brushes still sat in their wrapping, and against the wall stood a scarred old work table that did not match a single other thing in the entire pristine house, and I realized, with a small lurch, that he must have had it found and brought in specially, because new tables are too clean and too rigid to trust a 400-year-old varnish to, and only someone who had actually asked a restorer, or read about one very carefully, would ever know that. He had done his research. He had walked into the worst week of my life, already knowing what kind of table my hands would need. It should have felt like being watched. It felt, traitorously, like being seen. "Adrian." My voice had gone strange. "You built me a studio." "I built an asset, a workspace. It's in the contract. Your independence is maintained." He had already moved on down the hall, not looking back, and I understood that this was how he was going to do it. Every kindness disguised as a transaction, every soft thing wrapped in cold paper so neither of us had to call it what it was. My wing is the west side. We don't enter each other's without invitation. The staff are discreet and well paid. Treat them well, and they'll treat you the same. Breakfast is the one meal we'll take together, for the look of the thing, the staff talk, and a marriage that never shares a breakfast is a marriage that gets noticed. So we perform marriage at breakfast and ignore each other the rest of the day. Yes. That's the saddest sentence I've ever heard, and I grew up in a failing art gallery.
He stopped at that, turned.
And for a moment the estate agent dropped away, and there was just a tired man in an enormous house looking at a woman who had said the quiet thing out loud, the way I apparently could not stop doing. "It's not meant to be sad," he said. "It's meant to be survivable. There's a difference, and you'll learn to be grateful for it." Then the door closed behind his eyes again. "Settle in. We have dinner with the Hammonds on Thursday. They're the first test. I'll brief you tomorrow." I unpacked my 4 boxes into a wing the size of my old building, and I cried a little, and then I did what I always do, which is make tea and refuse to be defeated by a room. I found him that evening because I got lost. Genuinely lost. The house was absurd, and followed the only sound in all that glass quiet, which was a piano, played badly, by someone who clearly thought no one could hear. I rounded a corner, and there was Adrian Vale, the man who unsettled people by never being thrilled, sitting at a grand piano in a dim room, picking out something simple and halting and human with 2 fingers, getting it wrong, trying again. He stopped the instant he sensed me. The silence slammed back down. "You play?" I said from the doorway, because retreat would have been worse. "I don't." He closed the lid. "I'm learning."
Badly.
"It's..." He stopped, and I watched him decide whether to give me anything true, and watched him, to my astonishment, decide to. "There's a child," he said. "My brother's daughter.
Pip.
She's 7. My brother and his wife died 14 months ago, and she's mine now legally, except a court is not yet convinced that a man who lives alone in a glass building and works 90-hour weeks is the right home for a grieving 7-year-old. They're right to wonder. I wonder too." He looked at the closed piano lid. "She's coming to live here once the marriage once it looks like a home and not a head office. She likes the piano. I thought if I could play her something, even badly, the first night, it might be less frightening for her. To arrive somewhere with a little music in it." He stood, straightening his cuffs, rebuilding the wall brick by brick in front of me. "That's the reason, since you asked it in the gallery. The merger needs a stable image, yes. But the wife is for Pip. A court likes a married home. I'm buying my niece a family she can be allowed to keep. Now you know. I'd appreciate you not making it sentimental." I looked at this glacial, impossible, lonely man who had built a stranger a studio and was teaching himself the piano with 2 clumsy fingers so an orphan child would not be afraid, and I felt the first term of our contract. Never make the mistake of thinking this is real. Develop a hairline crack straight down the middle. "I won't make it sentimental," I said softly, "but I'm going to help you with the piano. You're holding your wrists wrong, and a 7-year-old will absolutely notice. Children are merciless. Sit down." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that I could not name and was not sure he could either. And then, the small miracle of it. Adrian Vale sat back down at the piano and let his fake wife put her warm, paint-stained hands over his cold ones on the keys, and we did not talk about the contract, or the merger, or the clause that said this could never be real, and for half an hour in a dim room in a glass house above the river, it was the least lonely either of us had been in a long time. He was a terrible student and an even worse liar about it. "I don't see why the wrist position matters," he said, in the exact aggrieved tone of a man unused to being bad at anything, and I laughed and showed him again, and his jaw set with a stubbornness that was almost endearing on a face that severe. "Pip will forgive a wrong note," I told him. "She will not forgive you looking like you'd rather be in a meeting. Children can smell a performance a mile off. So stop performing and just play her something small and true and a little bit wrong, and she'll know somebody made the effort for her." He went quiet at that. "Small and true and a little bit wrong," he repeated, as though I'd handed him a brief he had no idea how to fill, and then he played the halting little phrase again, and this time he let it be clumsy on purpose, and it was, somehow, much better for it. "There," I said. "That one. Play her that one." He looked at his own hands on the keys, as if they belonged to a man he didn't quite recognize. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, not looking up. "The hands. Knowing what a frightened person needs." And I thought of my mother's hands over mine on the swab, her voice about keeping the keeping going, and I said, "My mum. She was the warmest person who ever lived, and she had no money and no luck, and she made everyone who walked through her door feel like the most interesting person in the world for as long as they stayed." I swallowed. "I'm only good at one thing, Adrian. I'm good at loving things out loud. It's a useless skill in your world. It bankrupted me in mine. But it's the only thing I've got, so I'm going to use it on your piano and your terrifying empty house and your scared little niece, and you'll just have to put up with it, because it wasn't in the contract, and you can't find me for it." He was quiet a long moment. "No," he said at last, very low. "I don't suppose I can." Which was, of course, exactly the thing we had both signed a document promising would never happen. He pulled his hands back first. He always would in the beginning. "Thank you," he said, formal again, standing, the warmth folding away like a flag at dusk. That was useful. "Good night, Esme." And he was gone, down the west corridor that wasn't mine to follow him into, and I sat alone on the piano bench in the dark and pressed my own warm hands together where his cold ones had been and told myself, firmly, that I was a sensible woman who had signed a sensible contract for an excellent reason, and that the reason was a building full of my mother's love, and not the lonely man learning piano for a child who wasn't his. I almost believed me. I went back to my wing the long way, past the wall of windows, and the city glittered down there indifferent and huge, and somewhere out in it my mother's gallery sat dark and safe and saved, mine free and clear in 90 days' time whatever happened. I had what I came for. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I lay awake in the most comfortable bed I had ever owned, in a wing the size of a life, and thought about a man who said survivable like it was the most you could ask of anything, and a little girl arriving soon to a glass house with two-fingered music in it, and I understood that I had walked into this marriage certain I was the one being saved, and that I had not once, in all my 4 readings of that contract, considered the possibility that I might end up wanting to do some saving.
Of my own.
The Hammond dinner was Thursday. The first test, he'd called it. I had no idea yet that the real test would not be whether the city believed we were married. It would be whether I could keep remembering that we weren't. To be continued. That was episode 2 of Paper Vows. If Esme and Adrian have your heart, the next episode is already waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The complete book is on Amazon, and early episodes plus bonus scenes are on my Patreon. Links are in the description.
Mia.
Thank you for listening.